So, welcome to a special edition of On the Road with Mr. O. We're about 3 hours into retirement, and I've already discovered something about retirement. You spend a lot of time thinking about James Polk. Now, for those of you who don't remember James Polk from the beginning of the year, Polk was the president who's probably most famous for the Mexican-American War. But he was also famous for the taking of a portion of Canada, what we think about as Washington, Oregon, Northwest Montana. And the famous line was 54-40 or fight. And as we're driving through Canada, I found myself thinking a lot about that element of our history. Now, for many of us, for most of us who grew up in Montana, the history that we really got more than anything else was Lewis and Clark. We got them in, kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade, fifth grade, seventh grade. We just did Lewis and Clark all the time. And being residents of Kalispell, we're kind of left out of that story. We have Bozeman gets their portion of Lewis and Clark. Billings does. Great Falls really does. Missoula even will claim Lewis and Clark, but not Kalispell. And part of the reason for that is James Polk. In many ways, our origin story isn't the origin story of the United States here in Kalispell. Our origin story has a lot more to do with Canada. And of course, as we were getting ready to go to Golden for our retirement celebration in British Columbia, I started to look up Golden and its history, and a lot of its history ties right into the same history that we have. So that's going to be what this episode talks about, is a little bit of that connection between Canada and Kalispell, and how in many ways our origin story would have been far more important in Kalispell if we had actually remained Canadians. So, in a week or so, I will put this together, but for you, it'll only be a few seconds. See you in a second. Bye. So, Mrs. O and I are back from Golden, British Columbia. And as promised, I've got an interesting set of notes for you on David Thompson, so make sure you get out your notebook, take your notes. There'll be a quiz afterwards. David Thompson is born in 1770, and he, at the age of 2, loses his father. And his mother, who is impoverished, eventually enrolls him in the Grey Coat School in London, which is a school designed for kids of poor parents. And he spends 7 years studying at the Grey Coat School, where he graduates at the age of 14. So he's basically what we would view as a freshman. And at that point, a company comes along called the Hudson Bay Company, which recruits him and ends up paying a fee to the Grey Coat School, and hires him on as a worker for the Hudson Bay Company. At which point they stick him on a boat, the Rupert, and he at 14 years old, he ends up leaving England and waving goodbye to his mother, and he will never see either of those again. He arrives in Churchill, Manitoba, which one historian referred to as a miserable cluster of wooden buildings. And he's all on his own, living in these barracks that the Hudson Bay Company provides. At 18, he is out cutting wood for winter heat and ends up breaking his leg. And it's a pretty serious break, a compound fracture that's going to take over a year to heal. However, in many ways, it is Thompson's big break, because during that year, he gets bored. Now, when I hurt my knee and was out for a number of weeks, I spent my time watching White Lotus and The Boys and catching up on all sorts of National Geographic specials. David Thompson decides to become a cartographer. He pesters one of the men at the colony that has this cartography skill, and the guy teaches him all that he knows, and Thompson turns into a superior student. And at the age of 18, he already has mastered many of the principles of cartography, and particularly of star watching and being able to track travel via the stars. So Thompson ends up being assigned by the Hudson Bay Company as a chief cartographer as they end up moving into the exploration of the Canadian Southwest and what we would view as the American Northwest. Now, before we go any further, I think it's important that we take just a moment to talk about the Hudson Bay Company and the fact that it has a rival known as the Northwest Company. Now, Thompson starts out with the Hudson Bay Company, and he's largely there as a cartographer, but the primary focus is going to be searching rivers in order to find beaver pelts. Thompson wants to do more exploration. And when the Northwest Company comes to him with a much grander scheme right after Lewis and Clark have finished their expedition and the opportunity to explore the Columbia River Valley and the tributaries that come off of the Columbia, Thompson jumps at this opportunity. And it gives him the chance to go out and explore the West. Where he launches off from is a little town in British Columbia called Invermere. When Mrs. O and I were coming back from Golden, British Columbia, we stopped in Invermere for lunch because I thought we would have some sort of museum or big display of Thompson's first fort at Invermere, and there's basically not much there at Invermere. In fact, the only thing that remains at Invermere is an old tourist attraction that was created in the 1920s that became ruins because it ended up failing. It was an attempt to exploit this new interest in Western Canadian history. But it ended up failing, and there's not a whole lot in Invermere at this point. However, it is the launching point for David Thompson, which will eventually bring him to Golden. Now, Golden becomes important in this whole story because the Kicking Horse River, which you're seeing here, flows into the Columbia River at Golden, and this is the confluence of those two rivers. Those two rivers, and particularly the Kicking Horse, was renowned for having a rich supply of beaver pelts. So Mrs. O and I decided we had to go see Confluence Point when we were in Golden. And then we set out on what our typical adventure is, and I know this sounds a little odd, but this is what high school teachers do. We had to go find the local high school and go look at the local high school in Golden. And while we were doing that, we ran into Golden's little tiny museum, and we pulled into this museum, and when we pulled in, Mrs. O, and I've got to admit myself to a certain extent, looked at it and we weren't sure it was actually a real museum. It looked dilapidated, there was long grass growing, it hadn't been mowed in months, and we both were a little hesitant, and Mrs. O, being the unfiltered type that she is, had a number of comments about the museum, but we decided to go in. And when you went in, it's actually a really cool little museum. And the very first thing it does is talk about the beaver trade and how important that was in Golden. The big piece of the beaver trade that occurred that was a little different than I understood it was they talked about the complete wipeout of the European beaver, that animal was hunted to extinction in Western Europe. There were only a handful at this point left up in Scandinavia because since 1500, Europeans had become enamored with beaver coats, beaver hats, all of those things that allowed the beaver to become so important in Europe, ultimately led to its own destruction. So when they end up in North America, both the United States and Canada, the beaver pelt as they move west becomes more and more valuable, and Golden became one of the centers of that. There were a couple of other interesting pieces about Golden that we're not going to spend a lot of time here, but they actually had the largest Sikh population in all of Western United States or Western Canada. They also brought in Swiss mountain climbers because the mountains were so extreme that when the first tourists came, they needed people who actually knew how to climb the mountains and manage the skiing at Golden. But the other part that I found interesting was their display on David Thompson. And it covered a couple of things that oftentimes you don't find in the history books or on the web pages about David Thompson. One of the most interesting pieces to me about Thompson is his view of the native population. First of all, he has a Métis wife, which is a white and Canadian Native American marriage that leads to a child. That's a Métis individual. So he has some understanding of the Native American culture. I believe she was Cree, part Cree. But David Thompson had a pretty progressive view of what was going on between whites and Native Americans. He didn't feel like the trade was doing a lot for the Native American culture, and particularly the amount of alcohol that was being traded to Native Americans. He saw it as helping to destroy their culture and cause all sorts of issues, which is a little bit unusual for one of the white traders at the time. So it went into that detail with David Thompson. It also talked a little bit about David Thompson's interest far more in cartography and exploration than in any type of interest in the beaver trade, but he recognized that piece was part of what was paying his salary. So he was always sending back those notations, and Thompson was a prolific note taker, so the Northwest Company mined a great deal of information from him. Now, eventually he moves on from Golden, and the Columbia meanders its way back into what we would see as Montana and then Idaho. He ends up on the Kootenai River, up by Libby, and then ends up establishing a fort in what is modern-day Idaho on Lake Pend Oreille. That fort is called the Kalispell House, which is, of course, a derivation of the name Kalispell. From there, he ends up creating a fort a few miles out of what is now Thompson Falls, called the Salish House. About 5 miles outside of Thompson Falls, you will find the Salish House. So Thompson builds a pretty strong reputation when he is at the Salish House as a fair broker. And that reputation almost gets destroyed with an incident that occurs between one of Thompson's men and a Native American girl. The word that Thompson uses, and it's the word that shows up over and over again in the sources, is that there was an attempted seduction that occurred by one of Thompson's men upon a Native American woman. Instantly, as I started to read more about this, something doesn't add up with this. And this is where we get into, in our history classes, about really looking at your source analysis and reading critically. For example, one of the things you have to realize when you're dealing with that term, when we think of that term, we may think of somebody like Joey Tribbiani with his, "How you doing?" Or in my case, it would be, "Here's a plate of teriyaki chicken, dear." But seduction is probably a very light word for what occurred there, and for a number of reasons. First of all, the Salish demand death for the man who ended up committing this act. That's unusual for the Salish. They're considered to be a very reasonable, justice-oriented tribe, and for them to have that level of an extreme reaction indicates that this went much further than simply a seduction as we would think of it. Secondly, and I think this is really important to note, there was a lot of interaction between white males and Native American Indian women. With these fur trappers that are out there, with these explorers out there, many of them end up marrying Native American women, including Thompson. So the idea that there would be an interaction like this is not unusual, and therefore for the Native American tribe to have this kind of reaction indicates it may have been much more. My guess is that the better word than seduction probably would have been the word assault. And it would have been really interesting to see if we had had a Salish accounting of what occurred and that we weren't just relying upon Thompson's word. So what the Salish want is the death penalty for this individual, and Thompson is concerned because he has only so many men and he needs this man. So he sits down with the Salish leadership and they come to an agreement. And their agreement is that if this occurs again, the man will be gelded, which solves the problem the Salish are concerned about, but also allows Thompson to keep the parts of the man that he actually needs for his exploration. After this event, Thompson decides it's probably time to continue his journey, and he sets out for down the Columbia River to find the mouth of the Columbia, which he has already read about from the Lewis and Clark journals. Now, this is a good point to back up just a minute. Already this region is being contested. Who's going to control what we view as the northwest of the United States or the southwest of Canada? And John Jacob Astor, a very famous American businessman, had actually set up an agreement with the Northwest Company in which they were going to create a joint operation to set up a fort on the Columbia River. And David Thompson was supposed to lead this expedition. However, the deal falls apart, and in the end, John Astor will go his own way. At this point, the American military threatens to deal with the Thompson's expedition if they catch them in the region. Thompson is ordered by the Northwest Company to simply ignore the American military threat because it's hard to enforce that in such a remote area. But already you can see that conflict coming. Now, John Astor, as David Thompson heads down the Columbia, John Astor has sent men all the way around South America and up the coast, and they actually beat David Thompson's men to the mouth of the Columbia and have already set up a fort. Now, despite the U.S. Army threat, most whites, when they encounter each other in these remote areas, whether they're Canadian, they're British, they are Russian, they are Americans, tend to cooperate because it's difficult enough in that region without threats from each other. And in fact, that happens in this case. Thompson and his men spend some time at what becomes known Fort Astoria and eventually head back up the Columbia River, where we will run into Thompson and his interaction with our own local area of the Flathead Valley. So Thompson's mission along the Columbia starts in 1807 and is going to end in 1812. And one of the very last things he ends up doing is crossing over from the Clark Fork over to what today would be north of Pablo, and ends up on a place we believe called Goose Hill. And at Goose Hill, he ends up spending an afternoon just drawing pictures of Flathead Lake. And that's the closest that David Thompson comes to Kalispell, is his discovery of Flathead Lake. Certainly Native Americans had known it was there for thousands of years, but he's one of the first whites to actually discover it. Interestingly enough, though, despite the fact that the history books oftentimes give David Thompson credit for that, the first white that may have gotten there was a Hudson Bay Company worker who was ordered into the Flathead Valley to set up his own trading post. Robert House, who had actually worked with David Thompson before when they were both in the Hudson Bay Company, ends up setting a fort up just outside of Kalispell. And that fort is called House. Not maybe the best name for one of these places, but Robert House sets up this fort. And our belief is that it is somewhere along Ashley Creek between Kalispell and Summers. But we don't know. And why don't we know? Because Robert House didn't take notes. Thompson was a prolific note taker, but Robert House didn't take notes, and therefore Robert House was forgotten. And Robert House will not be remembered in history like David Thompson is, who took the notes down. So that's for you, Badge Bussy. Don't you forget to take the notes. So, Robert House ends up here on near Flathead Lake, and eventually will be run out of the region. In fact, he only makes it a few months after setting up the house because the Blackfeet Indians discover that he is here and don't want him trading weapons to the Salish, who is a traditional enemy. And in fact, the Butte Standard writes an article much later about Robert House and the fact that the story was that they actually had to abandon House at the last minute as the Blackfeet were coming in and had to escape to the Salish and ended up close to Salish House in Thompson Falls, getting protected by both the Salish Indians and the Northwest Company's Salish House. So the very first white into the Flathead Valley may have been Robert House, but we don't have a lot of material on him. In fact, the only material we have on him actually comes from David Thompson's journals, because Thompson reports on it in order to let the Northwest Company know what their rival, the Hudson Bay Company, is doing. So 1812 comes along, and this becomes the end of Thompson's great exploration of the Columbia tributaries and the Columbia River Valley. And what ends up happening is a war intervenes. Now, you might think of the War of 1812, but that's not what it was. It was actually a war about dried meat bars that were used by trappers and traders to get through the hungry times and to travel on. One of the crossroads was cutting off the use of pemmican, and it becomes known as the Pemmican War and makes it much harder and actually creates a delay in exploration of this area during that time period. And Thompson decides this is a good time to exit stage left and to head back to Montreal. And he and his wife head off to Montreal and set up their residence there. Now, Thompson will eventually have 13 children. He and his wife will be married for 58 years. It's actually the longest marriage in the history of Canada prior to Confederation in 1857. However, Thompson's story doesn't end real well. He is largely ignored by history while he is alive. In fact, he tries to publish his maps, can't find a publisher. And the sad part about it, he ends up dying in poverty. History tells us that's because of a series of bad investments. I think it might have had something to do with the 13 children that he ended up having. But Thompson's life is largely ignored at the time that he was alive. And for the greatest cartographer, probably in North American history, that's surprising. It'll be 30 years before his maps get published. And really, Canada doesn't start to really push this David Thompson story in its history books until the 1950s and the 1960s, where Thompson will reemerge as a national hero and certainly still have an effect even on our region of the United States. And that would have been the story of a place like Kalispell or the Flathead Valley. So that's the end of David Thompson. Now, my curiosity for you is, how much did you learn about David Thompson in elementary school, in middle school, even in high school? Drop that in the comments. I'd be really curious to hear what you guys knew about David Thompson. I also encourage you to subscribe so that you don't miss the next episode of On the Go with Mr. O. These will become much more common as Mrs. O and I begin our travels, particularly as we do our southern tours. So with that, I will see you in the next episode. Take care.